August 15th, 1945. The day Japan's emperor announced surrender crackled across radios in Tokyo. But far from the proud city streets, in the bamboo-framed huts of Luzon, in the damp jungles of the Philippines, Japanese soldiers sat in silence. Some gripped their rifles tighter, refusing to believe. Others let their heads sink into their hands, the sweat of defeat mingling with the tropical heat. They were not ready to surrender, not yet. These men, isolated, cut off, surrounded, still clung to the only thing left that gave them purpose, their orders. Fight to the last man. Die before you surrender. For them, the emperor's voice was faint, distant, almost unreal. And so, in the shadows of the Pacific Islands, the war did not simply end on that August morning. It dragged on, days, weeks, months, like an echo refusing to fade. Imagine it. The world celebrating peace, fireworks lighting the skies over New York, London, Moscow. Families embracing, soldiers boarding ships home. Yet, in the humid jungles of Asia and the scattered atolls of the Pacific, pockets of men, hungry, diseased, broken, still believed the fight continued. Japan had lost everything. Its navy, once the terror of the seas, was gone, lying in rusting, shattered hulks at the bottom of the Pacific. Its air force, those proud Zeros that once danced across the sky, were swatted down by swarms of American fighters and bombers. Its armies, once sweeping across Asia like wildfire, were now reduced to tattered remnants, hiding in caves, starving in swamps, or trapped on islands bypassed by Allied advances. The dream of empire was gone, but for the soldiers who had given everything, surrender was unthinkable. And that's where our story truly begins. Japan's warrior code was different. The Western world never quite understood it, not then and not fully even now. The men of the imperial army were raised with the Bushido spirit, an iron devotion to honor, sacrifice, and loyalty to their emperor. To surrender was not only disgraceful, it was worse than death. It was shame that could stain a family for generations. Even in the final months, when Japan's cities were turned to ashes by American firebombs, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were consumed in nuclear fire, when rice itself was scarce and children starved, the military still preached, "Fight on, resist, die standing." And so they did. In the Philippines, the jungles became haunted by men who refused to believe the war had ended. Some had no radio, others had no contact with their command, and some simply believed, fervently, unshakably, that the reports of surrender were lies, clever tricks by the Americans to lure them out. You see, these men had been told for years that America was weak, that its soldiers were soft, its people indulgent. How could such a nation defeat the Empire of Japan? No, it had to be a trap. And so, while the world moved on, while Tokyo rebuilt, while American GIs returned home to start families and go to college on the GI Bill, here in these remote jungles, the war raged on. In Guam, in the Marianas, in New Guinea, in the Philippines, small groups of Japanese soldiers carried on guerrilla campaigns. Some attacked villages, others raided farms for food, others simply hid, surviving on roots, coconuts, and whatever they could hunt. The jungle swallowed them, bones and uniforms melting into the green. For locals, the war was never truly over. Farmers stumbled across armed men in ragged uniforms who barked orders at them in broken voices. Fishermen disappeared. Crops were stolen in the night. And always, in the shadows of the forest, the glint of a bayonet could be seen among the trees. Years passed, and still they fought on. This strange, haunting reality raises questions that echo even now. Why did they fight so long? Why did they cling to a lost cause when even their emperor had surrendered? The answer lies not only in Japan's culture, but in the very way its soldiers were trained, indoctrinated, and shaped from childhood. In the West, particularly under the Americans, a different philosophy emerged. Children were raised with freedom, encouraged to dream, to build, to question. But in Japan, from the earliest age, the state demanded loyalty, absolute, unquestioning loyalty. In the West, particularly under the Americans, a different philosophy emerged. Children were taught to imagine a future of their own making. They could be farmers, teachers, engineers, or even presidents. The idea was that every life held value, that each person could decide their path. But in Japan, things were different. The empire demanded that from the earliest days of school, children were molded into servants of the state. Little boys were told, "Your body belongs to the emperor. Your spirit belongs to Japan." They sang songs not of love or dreams, but of sacrifice and glory. They learned to march before they learned to question. They were drilled that to die for the emperor was the highest honor one could ever achieve. Imagine being told at age 6 that your life was not your own, that your only purpose was to give it up someday in war. By the time these boys became soldiers, their hearts were already hardened. They were not trained to think about survival. No, they were trained to endure pain, to obey, to sacrifice without hesitation. Officers barked into their ears that Americans were cowards, that surrender was never an option. And for those who dared question, whispered, punishment was swift and brutal. This was not just military discipline, it was indoctrination. An unshakable belief that the emperor was divine, that Japan could not, would not lose. So, even when Japan lay in ruins, its navy sunk, its skies lost, its people starving, these men, scattered in the jungles and islands, clung to the only truth they knew: the war must go on. Think of the psychology of it. If you had spent your entire life believing that surrender was worse than death, if you were told from childhood that America was weak, that Japan's spirit was unbreakable, could you, in one radio broadcast, simply accept defeat? No. You would fight on. You would refuse to believe. You would dismiss reports of surrender as enemy lies. And that's exactly what happened. Take the Philippines. In Luzon, in Mindoro, in Palawan, the jungles remained alive with men in faded khaki uniforms. Some carried rusting rifles, others still had machine guns hidden away in caves. They raided villages, they ambushed patrols, they lived off whatever the land provided. The war for them was not over in 1945, not in 1946, not even in 1950. For some, the war did not end until the 1970s. But before we reach those astonishing tales, we must understand the scale of it. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, more than 6.5 million Japanese soldiers were still scattered across Asia and the Pacific. Some were stationed in China, others in Burma. Tens of thousands across the islands, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Truk, New Guinea, Guam, the Philippines. It was the largest demobilization in human history. Most laid down their arms and accepted fate. They marched into prisoner of war camps. They signed documents of surrender. They returned, broken, to their homeland. But thousands, yes, thousands, refused. Some because they never heard the surrender. Others because they refused to believe it. And still others because surrender was a shame too great to bear. So when the rest of the world celebrated peace, these men continued to live in war. Years blurred together in the jungles. Their uniforms rotted. Their boots fell apart. They stitched sandals from bark. They ate whatever they could find: snakes, monkeys, roots, coconuts. Some formed small bands, clinging together in loyalty. Others wandered alone, shadows in the forest. They carved new lives in the wilderness. They built shelters from bamboo and palm leaves. They hoarded bullets as treasures. They sharpened bayonets again and again, waiting for the moment when battle might return. To them, the empire still stood. To them, Tokyo had not fallen. To them, the war was eternal. This is where legends began to form. Local villagers whispered of ghost soldiers in the jungle. Farmers told tales of crops stolen in the night. Hunters stumbled on strange camps hidden in the trees. American troops, long after the war, still found themselves on occasional patrols, not against organized Japanese divisions, but against desperate holdouts who refused to die. And the stories that emerged from these encounters are some of the most haunting of World War II. The stories of these holdouts are almost unbelievable. Men who refused to accept surrender, men who clung to their rifles for decades, men who became myths in the very jungles where they hid. Some were tragic, some were violent, and some were almost poetic. Take the island of Guam. When the Americans liberated it in 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed or captured, but a few slipped away, retreating deep into the dense forests. For years, villagers reported strange encounters, footprints by streams, fishing lines made from vines, traps hidden among the trees. The Japanese were still out there. And indeed they were. Small groups continued to survive long after Japan's surrender, scavenging what they could, raiding farms, sometimes ambushing unsuspecting locals. Some lived for years unseen. Others fought until they were hunted down. But one story stands above the rest: Shuichi Yokoi. A tailor's apprentice before the war, conscripted into the imperial army. He was sent to Guam, tasked with logistics and supply work. But when the island fell, he fled into the jungle with a small band of comrades. At first, they were a group. They built shelters, gathered food, and lived like ghosts in the forest. But as years passed, disease and hunger claimed some. Others ventured too close to villages and were killed. Eventually, Yokoi was alone. Alone for nearly 30 years. Imagine it. The world had changed. While Yokoi crouched in his underground burrow, feeding on roots, eels, and wild fruit, the Korean War raged and ended. The Cold War began. Television spread across America. Man landed on the moon. Yet Yokoi remained in the jungle, convinced the war still continued, or at least that to surrender would be a shame he could never bear. He wove clothes from tree bark. He hid by day, foraging by night. He avoided all human contact, terrified that capture would mean humiliation. And so, for 3 decades, he lived as a relic of a war long ended. Finally, In January 1972, two hunters stumbled upon him while checking their traps. Yokoi, weak and trembling, tried to defend himself but was easily subdued. When they brought him out of the jungle, emaciated and trembling, the world gasped. Here was a man who had missed 27 years of history. A man still bowing deeply, apologizing for surviving when his comrades had died. He still spoke of the emperor with reverence. When he returned to Japan, millions lined the streets to see him. Some cheered him as a hero of loyalty. Others pitied him as a man wasted by delusion. But Yokoi himself said, in his frail, humble voice, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." His words pierced Japan's heart. They revealed the depth of indoctrination, that even after 30 years of solitude, hunger, and suffering, his greatest feeling was not relief, but shame. Shame for not having died in battle. And Yokoi was not the only one. On other islands, similar stories unfolded. In the Philippines, a man named Hiro Onoda would survive even longer, nearly 30 years, refusing to believe the war was over. But his story is even more extraordinary. Onoda was not just a soldier, he was an intelligence officer, trained in guerrilla tactics and survival. When the war ended, his unit melted into the mountains of Lubang Island. Unlike Yokoi, Onoda had comrades who shared his determination. They stole rice from farmers, ambushed search parties, and held out for decades. Leaflets dropped from planes declaring the war's end were dismissed as American tricks. Even letters from family members were ignored. To them, surrender could not be real. Think of the decades that passed. While Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse, while skyscrapers rose in Tokyo and bullet trains thundered across Honshu, while children grew up never knowing war, Onoda and his men still patrolled the jungle with rusting rifles, convinced they were carrying out the emperor's orders. Their war did not end until 1974, when finally a young adventurer from Japan tracked Onoda down and convinced him the war truly was over. Even then, Onoda refused to surrender until his former commanding officer, brought out of retirement, personally relieved him of duty. Only then, after nearly 30 years, did Onoda lay down his rifle. These stories are not just tales of survival. They are windows into the mindset of a nation at war. They show us how deeply the code of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice was burned into the hearts of Japanese soldiers. Even when the world changed, even when Japan itself had moved on, they remained behind, frozen in 1945, ghosts of a lost empire. Hiroo Onoda's surrender in 1974 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Nearly 30 years after the emperor's voice crackled across the airwaves, nearly 30 years after Tokyo's ashes began to bloom into skyscrapers, nearly 30 years after peace had reshaped the world, one soldier stepped out of the jungle, his rifle still ready, his uniform still patched, his eyes still sharp with duty. Onoda had lived in another world, one where Japan had not surrendered, where the empire still demanded his service, where his comrades' sacrifices still called out to him in the night. When his former commanding officer arrived in the Philippines and delivered the words Onoda had waited decades to hear, "You are hereby relieved of duty," it was as if time itself broke. The war for him was finally over. He handed over his sword, his rifle, his ammunition. He bowed deeply, and for the first time in 30 years, he allowed himself to believe that peace was real. The world was stunned. Television cameras swarmed. Newspapers printed his photograph on front pages from Tokyo to New York. And when Onoda returned to Japan, he stepped into a society he no longer recognized. Neon lights, bullet trains, modern cars. It was not the empire he had left. It was a nation reborn. Yet even then, the old instincts clung to him. He admitted that surrender had been the hardest thing he had ever done. He carried the weight of those years in the jungle like a scar that could never fade. Onoda was one of the last, but not the only one. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and even into the 70s, lone Japanese soldiers were still discovered in scattered corners of the Pacific. Some emerged quietly, too weak to fight. Others resisted until the end. They were the final shadows of a war that had consumed millions of lives, the last echoes of an empire that once sought to dominate the Pacific. And so, what can we learn from these holdouts? They remind us that war does not simply end with a treaty or a radio broadcast. For those who fight, war burrows deep into the soul. It reshapes identity, belief, and purpose. For the Japanese holdouts, surrender was not just defeat, it was unthinkable. Their loyalty to the emperor, their devotion to Bushido, and the indoctrination of their youth chained them to a war long after the guns had fallen silent. They became living ghosts, reminders of both the tragedy of blind loyalty and the astonishing endurance of the human spirit. Think of it. While the rest of the world was moving on, building new cities, celebrating peace, exploring space, these men lived in silence, in shadows, in jungles, convinced they still carried the weight of a fallen empire on their shoulders. It is haunting. It is tragic. And yet, it is a story that must never be forgotten. My friends, we've walked through history together. We've stood in the jungles of the Philippines, heard the whispers of men who refused to surrender, felt the weight of decades lost to war. These are not just tales of soldiers. They are lessons of humanity, of loyalty, of belief, of how far men will go when their hearts refuse to let go of the past. And if you've stayed with me this far, through every word of this journey, I want to thank you, truly. If you enjoyed this storytelling, if it moved you, if it taught you something new, if it made you pause and reflect, then I'd love for you to join me again. Please, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with others who love history as much as you do. Because together, we can keep these forgotten stories alive. Until next time, thank you for listening, and may we never forget the echoes of the past.